She was 26 years old, and by the first frost of autumn, she had nowhere left to call her own. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had been dead 8 months, thrown from a wagon on the Cedar Hollow Road, and his mother, Prudence Hale, had waited only until the harvest was in before telling her plainly that a widowed daughter-in-law, with no children to show for the marriage, was a mouth the family farm could no longer feed. In her small cloth purse, Verity Hale carried $6.20, the whole of what remained from selling her wedding quilt, and a set of silver spoons that had been her own mother's, and with it, she meant to buy herself some kind of roof before winter closed the passes. What she found, standing derelict and half swallowed by chokecherry brush at the edge of town, was the old Bragg smithy, a forge abandoned for nearly 20 years, its chimney cracked, and its anvil rusted fast to its stump, offered to her for $4.50 by a town council, eager to be rid of a property nobody would claim. Folks who watched her hand over nearly all she had for a ruined forge, with a caved roof and a dead man's tools still hanging on the wall, called it the last foolish act of a woman who had lost her senses along with her husband. They did not know that behind the smithy's great leather bellows, sealed away in a hollow of the wall for 2 decades, waited a bundle of letters that would not only give Verity Hale a home, but would mend a wound between 2 families that had bled this whole town quietly for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Hale. If you have ever stood on ground everyone else called ruined, and felt, against all reason, that it still had something left to give, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Verity had been born Verity Ansell in the spring of 1853, in a shingled farmhouse 2 miles outside Cedar Hollow, Nebraska Territory, in the years when the territory was still more grass than fence, and a family's whole fortune could rise or fall on a single season's rain. Her father, Josiah Ansell, farmed wheat and kept a small forge of his own behind the barn, not out of any great skill, but out of necessity, the nearest blacksmith being a day's ride distant, and it was there, watching her father hammer a bent plow blade back into true, that Verity first learned the lesson that would shape the whole of her life, though she could not have named it as a lesson at the time. Her father was not a patient man in most things, quick to temper over a spoiled crop or a broken fence, but at the forge he became someone else entirely, slow and deliberate, turning a piece of ruined iron over and over in the coals, until he found the angle from which it could be coaxed back into usefulness. He would tell her, wiping soot from his hands, that iron never truly broke, it only bent wrong, and that the whole art of smithing was learning to see the shape a thing wanted to be before you tried to force it into some other shape entirely. Verity, who was a quiet and watchful child, took this more to heart than her father ever intended, and she began to apply it well beyond the forge, mending torn dresses instead of discarding them, coaxing a wilted garden back to life with patient watering rather than giving it up for dead, sitting with sullen, friendless children at school until they unclenched enough to speak. She was, even as a girl, the sort of person neighbors sent for when something seemed beyond saving, because she alone among them seemed to believe that very little truly was. Her mother, Sarah Ansell, added to this a different but complementary gift, a fierce and practical kindness that showed itself most clearly in her insistence that debts of the heart mattered as much as debts of money, and that a family's good name was worth more than its land or its livestock, because a name, once tarnished, was far harder to mend than a wagon wheel or a fence post. Sarah had grown up in Ohio, in a household that had, in a quiet and unofficial way, aided runaway men and women fleeing enslavement in the years before the war, and though she rarely spoke of it directly, she raised Verity with the unshakable conviction that the measure of a person was found in what they did for those with no power to repay them. It was Sarah who first told Verity about the Bragg family, the town's original blacksmiths, who had settled Cedar Hollow alongside the Ansells and the Holloways in the earliest days of the territory, 3 families bound together by the particular loyalty of people who have broken hard ground side by side. Elias Bragg, the smith, had been Sarah's dear friend, a broad, laughing man with a gift for turning raw iron into anything the young settlement needed, plowshares and door hinges, and, when the times called for it, the reinforced false bottoms of wagons that carried more than grain across the territory line. Sarah spoke of him only in careful, half-finished sentences, the way a person speaks of something they loved and lost, and were never permitted to fully explain. And Verity grew up sensing, without understanding, that the name Bragg carried some old sorrow the town preferred not to disturb. That sorrow deepened into scandal the year Verity turned 6, when word spread through Cedar Hollow that Elias Bragg had been caught skimming payment from a shared grain cooperative fund entrusted to him by both the Ansell and Holloway families, money meant to buy seed and tools for the whole settlement in a lean year. He denied it, loudly, and then, as the town's suspicion hardened around him, with a kind of exhausted silence that many mistook for guilt. Within a season he had sold what little he could of the smithy's equipment, boarded up the forge, and left Cedar Hollow with his wife and infant son, under cover of a spring night, never to be seen or spoken of again, except in the lowered voices of adults who fell silent whenever a child wandered near. The friendship between the Ansells and the Holloways, once close as kin, curdled into a wary distance in the years that followed, for old Silas Holloway had lost the largest share of the missing cooperative money and never fully forgave what he saw as Josiah Ansell's continued, quiet loyalty to a man he believed a thief. The two families, who had broken the same ground and buried children in the same small cemetery, drew apart into something that was not quite feud, but was no longer quite friendship either, a coldness that passed down, mostly unexamined, to their children and their children's children, so that by the time Verity was grown, the Holloways and the Ansells merely nodded to one another in the street, and did no more business than manners required. Verity carried this half-understood family history the way she carried everything, quietly and without complaint, more concerned in her growing years with her own small trade, which had become, by her middle teens, a genuine skill at mending harness leather and simple ironwork that the town smiths considered beneath their time, hinges and latches, and the small repairs a farm needed weekly rather than yearly. She met Thomas Hale at 18, a steady, good-humored young rancher from a family newer to Cedar Hollow, and untouched by its old grievances. And their marriage, though not without the ordinary hardships of frontier life, was a contented one, built on the same patient partnership her own parents had modeled. Thomas admired his wife's stubborn refusal to see anything as beyond repair, teased her gently for keeping every bent nail and cracked tool she came across, certain some use would present itself eventually. And in the evenings, on the porch of the small house Thomas's family had given them, she would sometimes tell him what little she knew of the Bragg smithy, and the friendship it had broken, and he would listen the way he listened to everything she said, as though it mattered, which was, she came to understand only much later, one of the truest gifts a marriage could offer. Thomas Hale died on a clear October morning in 1879, thrown from a spooked wagon team on the rutted road above Cedar Hollow, and Verity, 26 years old and married not quite 8 years, found herself widowed with no children, no land in her own name, and a mother-in-law who had never entirely warmed to her, and who now, with her son gone, saw little reason to pretend otherwise. Prudence Hale was not a woman of open cruelty. She was, like Augustus Cain's family, in stories the old-timers told of another town's troubles, a woman whose coldness wore the mask of practicality, and within a month of the funeral, she had begun speaking, at first delicately, and then with increasing bluntness, of how the ranch could not properly support a widow who brought no children and no inheritance to the household, how it might be best, for everyone's sake, if Verity considered other arrangements. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene. There was only a slow tightening of hospitality, meals grown smaller and conversation grown thinner, until by the first hard frost, Prudence told her plainly, over breakfast, that she had written to a cousin in Ohio who might take Verity in, and that in the meantime, perhaps it was time Verity thought of finding lodging in town, since the ranch house, after all, had never truly been hers. Verity did not argue, because 8 years of marriage, into a family that had never fully claimed her as its own, had taught her there was little use in it, and because some stubborn, Forge-taught part of her believed that dignity was better preserved by leaving cleanly than by pleading to stay where she was not wanted. She packed what little was unquestionably her own: her mother's cedar sewing box, a small tin of savings she had kept apart from the household accounts, her father's old leather apron that Thomas had rescued for her from the Ansel farm sale after her parents passed, and walked into Cedar Hollow with $6.20 to her name, and no clear notion of where she would sleep past the coming week. She spent 3 nights in the spare room above the mercantile, offered by a sympathetic shopkeeper's wife, but understood within days that charity of that kind could not be relied upon indefinitely. And so she began walking the length of the small town each morning, looking for some cheap and overlooked corner she might claim outright. And it was on the 4th morning, following a path she had walked 100 times without truly seeing it, that she found herself standing before the ruin of the old Bragg smithy. It sat at the town's ragged edge, where the last buildings gave way to open prairie, a low structure of weathered plank and stone. Its roof caved in on one corner, its chimney cracked from 20 winters of frost, chokecherry and sumac grown up thick against its walls, as though the land itself had tried to reclaim what people had abandoned. Verity had passed it countless times in her married years, without giving it particular thought, beyond the old, half-remembered shame attached to its name. But that morning, with nowhere else to turn, as she found herself studying its ruin the way her father had once studied a bent plow blade, looking past the damage for the shape the thing still wanted to be, she went to the town council office, where she found old Reverend Fitch, who kept the county's odd bits of unclaimed business alongside his pulpit duties, and asked him plainly what might be done with the old smithy, since it had stood empty and untaxed for 2 decades, and belonged, by his own account, to no one living who cared to claim it. He told her, not unkindly, that the town would be glad to be rid of the eyesore and the modest tax burden it represented, and that if she had $4.50 and the nerve to live beside a building most folks still considered cursed by old scandal, he would draw up the paper himself that afternoon. Word traveled through Cedar Hollow before supper, as word always did, and more than one neighbor shook their head at the sight of Thomas Hale's young widow, spending nearly everything she had on the ruined Bragg smithy, calling it, in tones of pity more than malice, the last foolish decision of a woman too grieved to think clearly. It felt that way to Verity too, some nights, as she swept 2 decades of dust and swallow nests out of the forge room by lantern light, and told herself only that at least it kept the prairie wind at bay. The first weeks inside the smithy were spent in the unglamorous, grounding labor of making a ruin livable, and Verity approached the work the way she approached everything, without complaint, finding in the labor itself a kind of steadiness that grief alone could not offer. She patched the caved corner of the roof with salvaged shingle and borrowed tar, swept the stone floor clean of 2 decades of leaves and animal droppings, and began, out of both curiosity and practical need, to examine the smithing equipment Elias Bragg had left behind in his hurried departure. Tools too heavy or too worthless to a fleeing man to bother carrying, a rusted anvil fused to its stump, a scattering of tongs and hammers gone brittle with rust, and against the far wall, half collapsed but still recognizably itself, the great leather bellows that had once fed the forge's fire. It was in clearing brush and fallen plaster away from the bellows, meaning only to salvage what leather might still be sound enough to patch harness with, that Verity's hand found something the wall behind it should not have had: a section of plank set into the stone at an angle too deliberate to be accidental collapse, fitted with a care that spoke of a man who had wanted something hidden but not destroyed. She worked at it for the better part of an hour, with a pry bar borrowed from her father's old kit, until the loose plank came away, to reveal a narrow cavity, built into the wall itself, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff, and yellowed with 2 decades of dust, a bundle of letters tied with waxed cord, and beneath them, folded flat, a hand-drawn survey map of land she did not immediately recognize. It took Verity 3 careful evenings to work the letters apart, without tearing their brittle pages. And what she found there unspooled a story 20 years old, that reached back further into Cedar Hollow's history than she had ever imagined her own life could touch. The letters were written in two hands. One she recognized after a time as belonging to Elias Bragg himself, and the other, smaller and more careful, signed at the bottom of each page with the name Charlotte Holloway, a name Verity knew only distantly as belonging to old Silas Holloway's late sister, a woman who had died unmarried and largely unremarked upon sometime before Verity's own girlhood. The letters revealed, in the halting, earnest language of two people writing across a growing distance, that Elias Bragg and Charlotte Holloway had been secretly promised to one another in the months before the scandal broke, a match neither family had sanctioned, since old Silas Holloway had never approved of his sister marrying a tradesman, however respected, and had made his disapproval plain enough that the two had chosen to keep their engagement quiet until they could find some way to make it acceptable to both households. The earliest letters were full of ordinary tenderness and modest plans, but the tone shifted sharply in letters dated the same season as the cooperative fund scandal, growing urgent and frightened, and it was there that Verity found the truth the whole town had gotten wrong for 20 years. Elias Bragg had not stolen the cooperative's grain fund. According to his own careful account, written to Charlotte in what appeared to be his final days in Cedar Hollow, the money had in fact been taken by Silas Holloway himself, who had gambled away a considerable portion of it in Omaha during a supply trip, and had, upon returning short, quietly shifted blame onto the one man in town least able to defend himself against a Holloway's word, a tradesman with no family standing to protect him, and, crucially, a secret engagement to Silas's own sister that made him easy to discredit without arousing suspicion of the real culprit. Elias wrote that he had confronted Silas privately and been threatened, plainly, that if he tried to clear his name, he would ruin Charlotte's reputation, along with his own, by exposing their secret engagement as proof of some scheme to marry into Holloway money, a threat Elias could not risk, loving her as he did. Rather than destroy the woman he loved to save his own name, Elias Bragg had chosen to leave Cedar Hollow under the cloud of a crime he did not commit, taking his young wife, for he had in fact quietly married a different woman some years earlier that the town never fully knew of, and their infant son, and starting over somewhere. The Bragg name carried no shame, trusting that someday, somehow, the truth might find its way home, even if he could not carry it there himself. The final letter, written to Charlotte, and apparently never sent, for it remained folded inside the bundle rather than delivered, begged her forgiveness for a silence he could not break, and enclosed the hand-drawn survey map, a plat of a modest parcel of land at the eastern edge of the original township. Land, Elias explained, he had purchased jointly in secret with Charlotte's own small inheritance years before, meant to be the foundation of the home and family they had once planned to build together. Land that, by the letter's careful accounting, technically still belonged half to Charlotte Holloway's descendants and half to whatever family Elias Bragg had left behind, wherever they might now be. Verity sat with this discovery for a long while, before its full weight settled into her, turning back through the letters again and again, until the shape of the old wrong became unmistakable. A man had been driven from his home and stripped of his good name to protect the reputation of the very family that had wronged him, all to shield a secret love that neither family had ever been permitted to know had existed, and in the 2 decades since, that unhealed silence had calcified into the quiet estrangement between the Onsells and the Holloways that Verity herself had grown up half understanding, a coldness passed down through a generation that had never learned its true cause. She thought of her mother Sarah's careful, unfinished sentences about Elias Bragg, and understood now that her mother had likely known some fragment of the truth, or at least sensed it, and had never lived to say the rest. The survey map, when Verity examined it more closely by daylight, revealed something else as well, a small notation in Elias's hand, indicating that the parcel sat directly over the only reliable spring on that side of Cedar Hollow, a spring the town's growing eastern edge had struggled for years to access without drilling costly new wells, meaning that the land quietly forgotten in a 20-year-old secret was not merely sentimental, but genuinely, presently valuable to the whole community's future. Cedar Hollow, in 1879, had not forgotten the old scandal, though it had long since stopped questioning its settled version, for old Silas Holloway had died some years before, leaving his considerable local standing, and the shadow of that standing, to his son Marcus Holloway, a sharp, ambitious man, who had built himself into the principal shareholder of the Cedar Hollow Water and Land Company, the very outfit currently negotiating, none too quietly, to purchase the disputed eastern parcel from the county for a fraction of its worth, intending to control the spring privately and charge the town's growing eastern households for access to water they had once assumed would always be free and common. Verity did not go to Marcus Holloway first with what she had found, sensing correctly that a man building his fortune on land he did not fully know he had no clear claim to would not welcome its unraveling. But word of her discovery reached him regardless, carried by a well-meaning but talkative land surveyor she had consulted about the old plat. And within the week, Marcus Holloway himself came to call at the smithy, polite and smiling in a manner that did not reach his eyes, offering to buy the property outright from her for a sum that would have seemed a fortune only weeks before, framing it as an act of generosity toward a poor grieving widow who surely did not want the burden of an old ruin and its complications. Verity, who had learned patience at her father's forge and the quiet dignity of seeing worth where others saw only ruin, understood exactly what was being offered and exactly what it was meant to bury, and she declined as politely as the offer had been made, saying only that she had grown fond of her small home and did not wish to sell just yet. The smile left Marcus Holloway's face at that, and what followed in the weeks after was not open hostility, for men of his standing rarely dirtied their own hands, but a slow, deliberate campaign to make Verity's position in Cedar Hollow untenable. Rumors began to circulate that the widow at the old smithy was disturbed in her grief, imagining old scandals to justify holding on to worthless property out of stubbornness or spite. The mercantile, quite suddenly, grew reluctant to extend her the small credit it had once offered freely. Prudence Hale, hearing the talk, sent word through a neighbor that Verity's continued presence in town, tangled up now in old Holloway business, reflected poorly on the Hale family name, a coldness that stung more than Verity expected, though she had long since stopped hoping for warmth from that quarter. Even the surveyor who had first examined the old plat found himself abruptly informed that further county work might not come his way if he continued assisting a woman stirring up settled history, and he grew noticeably reluctant to speak with Verity further, torn between decency and the fear of losing his livelihood. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that leave no mark anyone could point to but wear at a person all the same, neighbors who crossed the street rather than stop to talk, children warned by careful parents to keep clear of the strange widow at the old smithy, conversations that fell abruptly silent when Verity drew near, and resumed, in lowered voices, once she had passed. She bore it the way she had learned to bear every hardship, without complaint, and without the satisfaction of letting anyone see how deeply it cut, though some nights, alone in the lantern light, with only Elias Bragg's careful, sorrowful handwriting for company, she allowed herself to wonder whether the truth was worth the isolation it seemed determined to cost her. It would have been easy, in the face of it, to sell the letters and the map quietly back to Marcus Holloway, for whatever price he offered, and start over somewhere the Holloway name held no power. And there were nights, huddled against the coming winter, with the forge's small fire her only warmth, when she considered exactly that. But she thought of Charlotte Holloway's careful, hopeful letters, of a young woman who had loved a good man, and never been permitted to say so aloud, even in her own family's memory, and she thought of her father's hands at the forge, patient and unyielding, finding the shape a bent thing still wanted to be, and she decided that she would not let a second generation of quiet lies decide what became of land that rightfully, and now provably, belonged half to a family the town had wronged. She began, carefully, and without fanfare, to build what evidence she could, to stand alongside the letters themselves, the way her father might have shaped a piece of stubborn iron, one deliberate strike at a time. She sought out Reverend Fitch, who kept the county's old land records alongside his other duties, and together they confirmed that the original purchase of the eastern parcel had indeed been recorded jointly, under both the Bragg and Holloway names, some 22 years before, a detail buried deep enough in dusty ledgers that no one currently living had thought to look for it, but plain and undeniable once found. She sought out old Mrs. Odell, a widow near 90, who had been Charlotte Holloway's closest girlhood friend, and who wept openly at the sight of Charlotte's handwriting, confirming everything the letters implied, and adding, in her own trembling voice, details Verity had not known, that Charlotte had grieved Elias's disappearance her whole quiet, unmarried life, and had once confided to Mrs. Odell, in her final illness, that she believed some grave injustice lay behind his leaving, though she had never had the proof to say so publicly. She wrote as well to the county courthouse in the territorial seat, requesting any surviving record of the old cooperative fund's accounts, uncertain whether 20-year-old paperwork would have survived at all, and while she waited for a reply that might never come, Marcus Holloway's pressure on her only intensified, culminating in a public meeting of the town's water board, ostensibly called to discuss the county's sale of the eastern parcel, though everyone in the room understood its true purpose was to see Verity's claim quietly, publicly dismissed, before it could gather further support. Marcus Holloway stood before the assembled board and townsfolk that evening and painted Verity as a grieving woman, clinging to fanciful old rumors to justify an irregular claim on land the Water and Land Company had already begun improving in good faith, his voice smooth and confident, in the way of a man who had never once expected to be seriously contradicted. It was old Mrs. Odell who rose first from the gathered crowd, her voice thin but steady, to say she had known Charlotte Holloway since girlhood and had heard Charlotte's own doubts about her brother's version of events, long before any widow at an old smithy ever appeared to trouble the town's peace. She was followed, to the visible surprise of the room, by Reverend Fitch himself, who read aloud, plainly and without embellishment, the county's original land record, confirming the joint purchase, and by a stiff but honest reply that had arrived from the territorial courthouse only that morning, confirming that surviving fragments of the old cooperative's accounts showed a shortfall traceable to a trip to Omaha taken by Silas Holloway in the very season the scandal broke, a detail no one in Cedar Hollow had thought to connect until Verity's letters gave it context. Verity herself spoke last, laying out Elias Bragg's own account alongside this corroborating evidence, with the same calm, unhurried precision her father had once brought to a piece of stubborn iron, refusing to raise her voice, even as Marcus Holloway's composure, for the first time anyone in that room had ever witnessed, visibly began to crack. The meeting ended that night without a formal ruling, for the water board was not equipped to settle land title on the spot. But something in Cedar Hollow shifted all the same, the way frost shifts a fence post over a long winter, invisibly at first, and then all at once undeniable. Within a fortnight, faced with a courthouse now taking a genuine interest in the old accounts, and with his own company's shareholders growing uneasy at the prospect of a public title dispute, Marcus Holloway quietly withdrew his company's bid to purchase the parcel, and the county, presented with clear evidence of the original joint ownership, formally recognized Verity's claim as executor of whatever remained of the Bragg line, alongside a claim she insisted, over the county clerk's mild surprise, be equally recorded in the name of Charlotte Holloway's nearest surviving kin, a niece living modestly 2 counties distant, who had never known her aunt's story at all. Holloway did not face criminal charges, for the theft was too old and too tangled in a dead man's absence to prosecute cleanly, but the quiet unraveling of his family's long unquestioned respectability cost him what mattered most to a man of his ambition, the trust of the very shareholders and townsfolk he had built his standing upon, and within the year he sold his interest in the Water and Land Company and left Cedar Hollow for a territory where the Holloway name had not yet grown so heavy with old debts. Verity did not claim the spring parcel for her own profit, though she could have, as its rightful co-owner, charged the town handsomely for the water it held. Instead, working alongside Charlotte's newly discovered niece, a warm, practical young woman named Delia, who traveled to Cedar Hollow to see the letters for herself, and wept, as Mrs. Odell had, over her aunt's long unspoken love, Verity arranged for the spring to be dedicated as common town property, its access free to every household on Cedar Hollow's eastern edge, with a small stone marker set beside it, reading only that the water was given in memory of Elias Bragg and Charlotte Holloway, two people once kept apart by fear, who were, in the end, the reason the town need never go thirsty. She kept the old smithy, repairing it further as the seasons allowed, reopening its forge, not for grand ironwork, but for the same small, patient repairs her father had once taught her, mending harness and hinges, and whatever else the town's growing eastern edge required. And it became, in time, no longer the shameful ruin folks had once shaken their heads over, but a modest, respected fixture of the community. The smithy, that had somehow, against all sense, ended up healing far more than iron. Delia Holloway and Verity became fast, unlikely friends, two women bound by letters written before either of them was born, and it was Delia, visiting one autumn, who first remarked, only half in jest, that perhaps the two families were owed a proper reunion after 20 years apart, an idea that took root slowly and became, within a few years, a standing tradition of a shared harvest gathering between the Ansell and Holloway descendants, held each fall at the smithy itself, where old wounds neither family had fully understood were allowed, at last, to close. She had been 26 and utterly without a home when she counted out $4.50 for a ruined smithy nobody else wanted, and there were those in Cedar Hollow who had called it the last foolish act of a grieving widow. But Verity Hale had learned, first at her father's forge, and then in the patient, unglamorous work of mending what other people discarded, that very little is ever truly beyond repair, that the damage in a thing, or in a family, is often only waiting for someone patient enough to find the shape it still wants to be. She had not gone looking for a lost fortune or a 20-year-old vindication when she pried that loose plank free behind the bellows. She had been looking only for salvageable leather to patch a harness, and had found instead an old wrong waiting quietly to be righted. What she restored in the end was never really about the spring, or even about her own survival. Though both mattered a great deal to a woman with almost nothing, it was about two people's love, hidden and then forgotten, spoken of again at last, around a harvest table. It was about a town remembering, the way iron remembers the shape a careful hand once gave it, that it need not stay bent forever. It was about the quietest, most overlooked things, a rusted forge, a bundle of letters, a widow with a tin box of coins, sometimes carrying within them everything needed to make a broken thing whole again. Thank you for spending this time with Verity Hale's story and with all of us here. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs reminding that hidden worth is still worth, even when the world has long since stopped looking for it. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps something as small and forgotten as an old forge behind a leather bellows. We read every story you share with us, and we are always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.